much for the intro. Context was mentioned earlier, incredibly important. So I've been in comms for about 20 odd years. I got into technology, PR predominantly to start with, very early on in sort of magazines which some of you might remember, things like PC Zone, Computer Shopper, PC Pro. I used to run all the comms for them. So I've been immersed in this sort of odd technological world for quite some time. My background was a fine artist, so I should never have been doing this stuff. But, you know, we all have interesting sort of journeys in life. I've worked with all sorts of different tech companies as well, outside of publishing, so in the games industry, in computing, in online sort of computing as well. And then sort of jumped ship and went into the agency world and started working with a raft of weird and wonderful people on a sort of a global basis. I had a sort of a change of, or rather, I don't know, a realisation about the age of 30 and thought I could be doing something a little different on the weekend, dressing up. So I joined the reserves. And that has taken me sort of all over the place to be people, you know, to do jobs like the spokesman in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in places like Kosovo. So I've operated in some fascinating environments, running communications in some really complicated places where you don't have the connectivity, but actually they're sort of global issues that people care about. So how do you have that transaction of information? Through that, and through all the weird and wonderful tech stuff I did, I started and was lucky enough to be allowed to play with social media as early as sort of 2005 and on operations on about 2008. So I'm sort of old hat at doing some of it, although even when I started I think I was way over the average age of people who were interested in that stuff. But it's taken me on an interesting journey. Where I work in M&C Saatchi, and we're made up of lots of different little entities. We're famous for the advertising campaigns that we've run sort of over the world, but now 55% of our sort of global revenue comes from digital and mobile. There's a massive shift change in terms of what people are after and how they're engaging with their audiences. So what I thought I'd do tonight is talk to you about some of the challenges that we're trying to deal with at the moment in terms of keeping up with the technology, keeping up with ways of getting to target audiences who are becoming much more fractured, much more complicated, harder to get to, and mobile's a really interesting way of doing it. Now, a bit more context, and some of you will probably recognise the guy that I'm going to show you, and actually I'm going to do two bits to this, technology and then content, because the two I think nowadays are massively linked. This guy Mark is a Silicon Valley investor, and back in 2011 he came up with this amazing statement which everybody loved at the time, and it meant a huge amount. Sorry, can you see that over here? Because computing had kicked in to such a degree and there was so much capability that was available through your desktop and your laptop PC that it started to change the way that people were communicating. It made a massive impact on our business in terms of how we needed to change things from being very TV orientated to very digitally orientated. But a couple of years later, a colleague of his, this guy here, Benedict, came up with a slightly different take on the way that the world was moving, in that mobile is eating the world, because we are going through this massive technological explosion at the moment, which 99% of the work that I deal with is outside the UK, has a huge impact on the challenges and the problems and the solutions that we're engineering for the people that we work with. And this is a really interesting illustration of that challenge and how it's impacting the world, in the sense that there's a massive amount of mobiles being produced on all sorts of different platforms, and I'll look at some of them a bit later on, but no one's not connected in a sense. We haven't touched everybody in the world, but this is an illustration of a border guard from North Korea in a very, in an environment that just isn't permissive. They don't have the freedoms that we have, but they're still connected. They're still using this new technology because, for all sorts of different reasons, and we'll go into those next, computing in terms of its cost has come down dramatically, so it's becoming available to all sorts of different people, and critically from a comms perspective and how you utilise all of this stuff, bandwidth has dropped through the floor as well. So that combination of computing power basically becoming incredibly cheap, as well as connectivity, means you can do some really exciting stuff, even in places where the environments aren't permissive. which is really useful for some of the stuff that we do. We work with people like the Gates Foundation, Nike Foundation, DFID and USAID, who are doing development projects all over the world. So being able to get to people who don't have the luxuries that we do in terms of our suite of sort of comms and magazines and newspapers and TV, getting to them in other ways is really, really important. And from a development perspective, this is really interesting stuff in a sense, that what mobile is doing is providing people, the poorest people around the world, with the opportunity to connect to people on a global basis that they could never do beforehand. So that explosion is also changing enormously. I'll get out of the way so you can read this. And again, this is one of the insights from Benedict, from Silicon Valley, because they're looking at sort of, the similar issues that we are, and we're taking the lead from, these sort of forward-thinking guys. But this stuff is really quite fascinating. When I was out in Afghanistan a couple of years ago, when you're dealing with the local population, it's really problematic. They can't read, and they don't have the money to buy any of this sort of mobile sort of capability. Not that there's any infrastructure either. So when you're doing communications and trying to tell them why you're there and what you're doing, it's really, really challenging. But we're getting to the stage now, and it was even to the stage in Kandahar, which was outside the area that the Brits worked in, but was a massive big city. They just accelerated all the evolutions that we've had to go through as a nation innovating. It's like the tube system. We invented it, brilliant. It was brilliant at the time. It's a bit of a challenge now. In fact, I've binned it completely and motorbike every day into work because I can't be doing with the trains. Or the third world and developing countries are just literally missing out all of that sort of evolution and are going straight for quickly implemented capabilities. So, even a couple of years ago, 2009 in Kandahar, out on patrol, and I've got guys bimbling past on their donkey, surfing the internet on their mobile phone. Because Kandahar at the time had one of the best Wi-Fi enabled networks in the world, because they'd just put dirt cheap kit in, and the coverage was absolutely fantastic. Sadly, we weren't allowed to take our mobiles with us, so we couldn't use any of it. But there's this massive ground shift. But what's fascinating is how you then start to understand how people are going to use this capability, because they've not experienced any of the stuff that we have. They've not gone on this sort of simple journey, this evolution where they understand what this massive capability brings them. And I thought I'd chuck in some numbers. Numbers are always great, because it shows you the scale of what's actually going on. These are stats from India, and when you look at the growth rate that's predicted from 2014 to 2017, it's massive. But that's nothing in comparison to the predictions of what they think it's going to do after 2017. The population out there is 1 point something billion, so that's not even covering, a great deal of it at the moment, but it's growing incredibly quickly. And if you can get to grips with what's happening and how you're going to deal with it, you can do some really, really interesting stuff. Now, let's go back to a bit of context. 2011, when it was all about software being king, that was because at the time, the desktop PC was king. It did fantastic stuff. And the rest of the sort of capabilities, the smartphones, were so early on in the evolution that they were really good, and they were very cool. And there's my original phone. I've still got one, actually, and it works. But they weren't brilliant in terms of being able to do all the stuff that you wanted it to do. Certainly not as good as the stuff that's coming out today. They were much less powerful and much less capable, but the tide has changed. And if you look, and we'll use last year as an example, what's happened is there's a massive shift in terms of capability. Laptops and desktops are increasingly becoming more and more obsolete, certainly for generations of us, and the way that people interact using mobile, emails. What the millennial generation are starting to use and pick up, and the apps that they're interested in are a million miles away from what we have all grown up with, or certainly people of my age in this room anyway. So what you've got now is a dominance of mobile technology, which is even having an impact on things like tablets, which are pretty cool, but they're not as cool when you think that that's a good bit of kit. But this knows where it is. It knows which direction it's pointing in. It knows what the weather is. I can have a conversation with it-ish. I can joke with it, certainly from Siri's perspective, and have fun when I'm bored. But it does an enormous amount now that hasn't been possible ever before, and that is just changing that whole dynamic between the relationship you have with, you know, the desktop and the laptop, because it's all browser based. This is developing this very different ecosystem, which is absolutely fascinating, and there's massive opportunity within that ecosystem as well. This is a great illustration, I suppose, of the way in which the technology has started to shift the opportunities that are available to entrepreneurs out there to start playing with it, monetizing it, making it of value to people. And in a sense, you know, just take the heart rate monitor, you then start to integrate it into an app, and suddenly, you know, fitness applications, being able to monitor what you're doing, track it, analyze it, increase your performance. Even as a, you know, not particularly brilliant athlete, I'm a dreadful athlete, you know, I'm totally immersed in all this stuff because it's so accessible and so easy to understand. It's changed the way I train. I feel guilty when I don't, because I get sent messages by my Nike app saying, "You lazy bastard, go and do some more exercise." It's really fascinating how it's starting to, you know, alter people's lives and their behaviour. And it's touching areas of people's lives that have never, ever had anything to do with technology before. And that's really interesting. And certainly interesting from some of the sort of the environments, you know, that we work in. Now, I've come up with a bit of a chronology in terms of how that technology is starting to adapt. In terms of where we are and where we're going into the future, we're already here. We're already got, you know, driverless cars. So we're moving down this environment incredibly quickly. And I was listening to, because I'm of that age, Radio 4 on my bike this morning going into work, and they were talking about the fact that, you know, Apple are having issues with their share price at the moment, but they're also talking about the diversification. And although it's unsubstantiated, Rory, you know, Kethlen Jones was talking about the fact that it's not beyond the realms of possibility, and there are certain rumours in the industry that Apple are going to start considering launching their own car. You only have to look at, you know, the Tesla, isn't it? Absolutely fantastic bit of kit with the biggest, you know, tablet built into the dashboard. It does some amazing stuff. So we are on this, you know, incredible journey into doing all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff. And from a comms perspective, we're incredibly excited about it because it means, and actually what's fascinating is you only have to think about the news yesterday that for the first time ever in the UK, kids' TV viewing habits have changed so much that they are now consuming online content, online TV content, either through a mobile or a sort of a desktop capability. Pardon me. For 3 hours a day, TV down to 2 hours a day, and that's a massive shift. I mean, I sit there and I'm guilty of it. My wife is as well. We'll be watching TV. I'll be on my phone. I'll be doing a bit of work at the same time. You know, that's why my concentration span is probably less than 8 seconds because I'm all over the place with all sorts of different gadgets. God, if I could do the entire thing on my mobile phone, it'd be a heck of a lot simpler. I wouldn't have to walk around with a bag and all the other bits and pieces. But there's this incredible journey that we're going on to, and there's some exciting stuff on the way. And I'll sort of allude to how we're playing with it a bit later on. But I'm going to talk about content now, because content's really interesting as well. And as has been mentioned before, from a sort of an advertising, from a communications perspective, without some compelling content, without some good imagery, and simplicity was mentioned earlier. Our mantra is brutal simplicity of thought. If you can overcomplicate stuff, it's terribly easy to do it. Really difficult to make it simple, but if you can do some exciting stuff. Now, what's interesting about content and the way people are consuming it, this, as of 2015, the year of the mobile. Look at how much mobile is dominating all of these different social activities. And that's really interesting. Facebook, I think the year before in 2014 was below 50%. So even that's going through a considerable change. But for some of the other ones, they are just, so well utilised on the mobile platform, and they're not available on, your desktop type capability. And probably if you're doing it at work, you want to be doing it off your main screen. But it just shows the dominance of mobile and how important it's becoming in all the stuff that you guys and people around the world are interested in. From a YouTube standpoint, this is really interesting stuff. And I mentioned earlier, the shift in the UK in terms of kids and how they're watching TV. It's incredible, the shift and the volume of content. And when you think about, from a cloud-based perspective, how YouTube are coping with the volume of stuff that's being uploaded and the legacy. I mean, I was uploading all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff as early as sort of 2005 for some of my clients. It's all still there, it's all still available. And every now and again someone goes and has a look at it. But massively important, and these figures speak volumes. But this is very much in the context of the West, and a lot of what I get involved in is not in the West. So I want to talk about these guys here. God, if I can pronounce it. I've been practicing it all day, and I knew I'd never get it right. It's Yangji, I think it is. Yes, that's the one. I even looked it up and got the computer to talk to me earlier, and I knew I'd forget it. So Xiaomi, it's a Chinese platform, and if I get it to work, last year they sold 70 million units. Now, again this morning when they talked about Apple, they talked about the fact that China is a massive market for them, and sales are stabilising, but at the same time you're shifting volume like that because of the low cost, because of the connectivity. It's becoming really exciting. But from our perspective, when a lot of the problem sets that I deal with aren't Western orientated, a white male middle class perspective on the use of social media isn't that useful. And it's summed up quite nicely by this guy here. Hugo used to be one of the senior guys at Android, and he started to see a fundamental shift in what was going on. He also looked at the way that the developing world was catching up and doing things in a different way. So he probably now has got the best CV in the industry to move around, in the sense that he understands the environment of where the West is coming from and how we use technology and how we build little ecosystems. Because if you think about your laptop and your mobile, they're very, very different. Browser based, it's apps based on your mobile. You build your own little ecosystem of stuff that you're interested in. My Nike app, my Army estimate process, which has now been made available by the MOD. It's a bit crap and doesn't work, but it's still there and I've got it. I bet none of you lot have got it. It's my little ecosphere. But cultures differ enormously, and this is what's really exciting about the problems that we get. And this next slide is a really interesting illustration of that. Now, this is us in the West. We like brutal simplicity. We like things to be clean, to be ordered, to be stylish. At China, it's slightly different. They want everything all at the same time, flashing at you. I didn't have the dynamic sort of gift to do this, but it does. If you've got a hangover, you don't want to be looking at one of their pages, because it's utterly, from my perspective, awful. I can't navigate it. It's just it's how the internet used to be, 10, 20, 10, that's now, and they absolutely love it. And it goes a sort of stage further in a weird way, and this is really critical in some of the stuff that we do, in that we like structure, we like order, we like stuff to be compartmentalised. I've got Facebook to do, stalking of various people from my past and catching up with other people who I know but would rather not see, pictures, all that sort of stuff, but I like to compartmentalise them so I know exactly what I'm getting from each. Over there, they do everything. From buying, from in-app purchases, from swiping in on the tube system. Everything's done from that one system. Because again, what they've done is accelerated, not had to go through this evolution of, oh, brilliant, we've got a really archaic email system, let's use that, wonderful. Because it does become slightly limiting. And I still struggle every now and then, thinking, how am I going to cope without email? But if I don't not use email, then I'm not communicating with my two daughters who are growing up. The eldest is 12, she has a phone, which I can track her on, which is brilliant. I track my wife as well. And she knows that. She can track me, but she hasn't quite sussed it yet. But, the way that you play with this technology, the way that you utilise it is absolutely, I keep on saying it, it's really incredible. But I suppose what we want to know is how it starts to really change things, how it starts to change the way we think, the way we plan campaigns, how we can start to pull together all of this knowledge that we're gaining, and then push it out to our customer base. But before I get there, I want to just talk about the sort of the mobile piece. Everyone talks about mobile as being, active, doing, but have a quick look, and if you can see them, it's, mobile is just the device, but the device can be absolutely anywhere. And this is really critical, not from my sort of development perspective, but if you want to flog products, this becomes really, really interesting stuff, because it's all about the journey. Now, it used to be the case if you wanted to buy something, you went to a shop, you had a look at it, you could touch it, feel it, walk away, come back, buy it, but it was pretty transactional. It was quite hands-on. It was a Saturday afternoon, God, we've got to go to Reading and fight through the crowds to go and get what we need. It's all started to change. You could do it on your computer. And in fact, we ran a fascinating campaign which did really well for Dixons, in the sense that, and we did it as Dixons, the last place you should go. Slightly tongue-in-cheek, because if you're ever going to buy anything, you're going to Dixons and have a look and see and feel it, because we like that touchy-feely experience, and then go online and buy it dirt cheap somewhere else. But actually, Dixons are pretty competitive in terms of what they're doing at the moment. So slightly tongue-in-cheek, big campaign, Dixons, the last place you'd go to get into that sort of buying cycle, because if you can change people's behaviour and get them to think, oh yeah, I went there first, but do you know what, I'll go there and then buy it online. Not great for the store, but it's brilliant for the e-commerce element, so their online marketing managers, getting a massive bonus. The stores aren't. But this is really interesting in a way that, and I'll move on to the next bit, it totally alters that customer journey. And I've got a nice little diagram which explains it. You've got that journey along the top, so you consider stuff. And if you're not going to be bothered to go into Reading on a Saturday afternoon to have a hold of what it is you're going to go and buy, you're going to go onto a search engine. And then you might go onto social media. I want to buy this, what do you all think? And you get a barrage of reviews, buy this, that, whatever. And then you go back, I don't trust any of that lot, I'm going to go and have another search and validate what they've been telling me. And then you might go off and look at a price comparison site. Who's got the best one? Is it Dixons really? Is that ad campaign that M&C Saatchi have come up with doing the trick? Or are they lying to us? What's fascinating, even if you take out the first brand comparison bit, if you're a brand owner, if you're the Dixons, or if you're a shop in Henley that has an online presence, the fourth stage in the journey, if you take out the brand comparison site, is your brand-owned channel. That's really interesting stuff, because mobile has really got in the way, as has social, that whole journey of how you do stuff. And that's what we're sort of grappling with at the moment, and how to deal with it. Now, social, because that's the theme of this evening, is incredibly important. It's the validation. And at the far end, being an advocate of something is so much more powerful. In PR and comms terms, we all talk about, owned, earned, and I can't remember what the third one is now. That's dreadful considering where I work. But anyway, that sort of social media piece, that earned element of any sort of brand experience, is incredibly powerful, as are the price comparisons. But it also illustrates how important good search engine optimization is, because if you're not appearing on any of the searches, then no one's going to get down this buying journey. So it is fascinating. Now, what I have got is an example of how we've sort of tackled a problem. And what I'm trying to sort of illustrate here is that sometimes this sort of imperfect buying sort of journey that you go on can be a real nightmare, but there are ways around it. There we go. Any questions?
Augmented reality and that last bit with the glasses, etc., as being something that's going to be really key moving forward, maybe 2016, 2017 for brands and marketing for?
It's already had a big impact across, I think, the industry. The army have started utilising that sort of technology as well, because the shift of going to some, and I'm in the TA, so I get this as well, and my TA centre in Reading looks awful from the outside. If you are a willing volunteer and you go to the main gates where we are, it's a pretty stark looking building, and you need to be made of steel to have the courage to go and press the door and then wait for some grumpy man in uniform to come and let you in and have a conversation. So they're coming up with weird and wonderful ways of using this sort of capability, because if you can get people, a captive audience, when they're out and about doing stuff, and then immerse them in an experience, it has a much more powerful driver on them. So if they're vaguely interested, by the time they've gone through an immersive experience like that, their decision-making process and their propensity to then sign on the line and go through the first stage of recruiting goes up enormously. So I think we'll see it being used more until the next bit of cool, exciting stuff kicks in. Oculus Rift is extremely expensive as well, and to deploy it you need lots and lots of people to run it and man it and maintain it. But the key will be to sort of do stuff that will immerse people without having to sort of stage events, which are costly. But it'll come, and people are, ploughing on with some really interesting stuff already. But yeah, it'll feature more and more, I think.
Do you think there's you mentioned India and the numbers and the sort of scale that's going on? Do you think that's where the big businesses are really looking at, certainly from an advertising perspective, really looking to make sort of significant inroads in the next few years, just because of that scale?
Yes, but also lots of places around the world where that don't have the same sort of freedoms that we do. I'm doing some work with a firm at the moment that runs one of the largest VPNs, and if you look at the places that are problematic around the world, they have restrictive media environments, control of the internet, but they will see spikes. So I think it was Brazil turned off the internet about 2 months ago for a period. They got 2 million extra users literally in a 48-hour period. What you then have the ability to do is, this little app is sitting on their system, on their mobile phone, on their desktop. You can then start having conversations with them if you want to. They've done some fascinating research whereby you can incentivize people with, do you know what, we won't serve you all these ads if you fill in a bit of research. We're going to ask you 5 simple questions. So in terms of emerging markets, there are, I can't remember which one it was, but there's a makeup manufacturer who is asking questions in Middle Eastern countries that are locked down in terms of the internet, because they can do so because they recognise that the world is becoming slightly more or less conservative. There are more freedoms, and actually there's a hell of a lot of women who probably want this stuff who don't have any access to it at all. So if you can get in there first and start pushing your brand and make it available, you can set the conditions for success when you've then got the ability, or sanctions lifted or whatever, to do interesting stuff. We find it really useful in terms of being able to ask questions about development work. We do a lot of work empowering girls and women in sort of sub-Saharan Africa, and you can do some really interesting sort of attitudinal research work that otherwise you'd never be able to get to, because you couldn't put face-to-face, quantitative polars out on the ground because it's not necessarily safe. But you can do it, via mobile. It is anonymous, so it comes with a sort of a sting in the tail, in a sense. The whole point of a privacy app is that you are private and give away nothing. But that's a really interesting capability. But I think it's everywhere. I did another project in East Africa, and this was 2012. We did some focus groups because we couldn't work out, there is no infrastructure. How are these people getting the internet? And an Australian firm at the time had come up with this capability called Binu, and basically it turned the internet into a photograph, so you could serve it onto a 2G phone, not even a smartphone. And you looked at it thinking, I'm looking at the internet, but you're looking at a picture of the internet. And using keystrokes, it would go back, forwards, next page. You didn't have the same, maneuverability that you do on a normal web page. But again, that was incredible. But again, we were looking at this and just a massive anomaly. How are these people experiencing this and understanding various sort of, development projects that are going on when there isn't any internet? We don't get it. And then you get the focus groups and realise, that's really sort of, groundbreaking stuff. And that was, 2012. We're now years past that, and the world has, turned yet again. So yeah, massive opportunity all over. Yeah.
YouTube Red to pay $10 a month and you don't get any adverts. Do you think that means that we're going to head towards a two-tier internet system where the rich people don't see any adverts and it's only the poor people end up being bombarded by adverts?
Who was I reading about today? One of the big media sites has now started to put blockers in as well. Is it going to be a two-tier system? No, I don't think there is, because there's always a way around things. If people want sort of premium content, yes, they'll probably go for it, but not necessarily because you don't get ads. You know, there are always other bolt-ons that tend to enhance the service rather than, do you know what, I can't be doing with all this, you know, rubbish anymore. You get other perks that justify, you know, paying the money. But at the same time, people will work out, you know, slightly different ways to get around it, or to, do you know what I mean? But people are terribly innovative, and if there's a way to make money doing something somehow or other, someone will come up with a new way of getting around any of the sort of the privacy and loops that people are creating.
It's like the Camel cigarettes when they said you can't advertise cigarettes anymore, so they advertised cigarette lighters.
Exactly. So no, you know, but it's going to evolve, because I think, you know, what people want. We've just done some research again for the US, looking at. I've got a client with a load of different media entities in the Middle East, but their engagement levels have started to go down. So we've been looking at various news stories, analysing it, seeing what the engagement is by country, and actually there are massive differences. In Egypt, people are 6 times more likely to go and digest and share content that's rich and long. So if it hasn't got an academic opinion in it, if it isn't, you know, 1,000 words long, people aren't going to, you know, push it out. Whereas, you know, people over in Turkey want short, sharp, pithy stuff, you know, much the same as we do. So again, you know, there's no one, you know, size fits all, I don't think, out there. Just lots of different variations. Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier for the augmented reality the cardboard, and I'm not sure if you were referring to Google Cardboard in particular. Obviously the Oculus Rift is expensive, but with Google Cardboard you can still have augmented reality. So do you think that can be used, maybe, like, obviously with that cardboard you can also do the 360-degree videos on YouTube. Do you think that could be a channel for something similar to this, which could be accessible to people here in the West and also in the developing world, because it's only a $10 cardboard and you can still immerse yourself?
Yeah.
So do you think it's...
And really important in the developing world as well, because you know, literacy rates aren't the same, education isn't the same. So trying to convey messaging, trying to sort of educate people about whatever it might be that you're doing, you know, water, you know, shortages and how to conserve stuff. If you can do that visually, and a lot of, you know, of the, you know, the countries that we work with have a terribly sort of, you know, oral tradition anyway, because they don't have the literature, they don't have the writers or the libraries. But if you can change it and make it visual at the same time, I think that's incredibly powerful, because it'll make it stick so much more. And it becomes more than just an experience of, you know, listening to a really good story. It's a, wow, you're totally immersed in it. In a way that you're not going to get through just sort of TV. Or watching TV through somebody's, you know, front window, or a shop, or in a sort of a communal setting, which is how, you know, it happens in a lot of parts of the world. But if you've got that sort of one-to-one, and then you can start doing interesting stuff in terms of, you know, you look at, you know, like, you know, kids' usage, and you know, I'm probably still old hat in terms of I quite like watching stuff when it appears on telly, you know, 9 o'clock, and, you know, there's always a good thing on a Sunday night. But I quite like the fact that I like a few boundaries, you know, put things where I expect them to be. What you can then start to do with the augmented stuff is serve people stuff that actually, you know, floats their boat. Like the emoticons, you know, you can tweak things. So it doesn't always have to be, you know, one solution for everybody. Subtle differences, and I think, you know, that one-to-one experience becomes really powerful.
Given that it's so easy now to go on Google and write some ads in Google AdWords or Facebook or Twitter or whatever, from an industry point of view, do you think there's more demand from businesses to hire agencies who can define a campaign for them and help them to navigate all these complicated advertising platforms, or less because it's easy for people to do it themselves? Is it kind of growing or shrinking or staying the same?
I suppose it depends on what you're trying to achieve. You know, I don't want to sort of come across as though, you know, the only solution is to go to, you know, creative agencies or agencies who get this, because I think, you know, there's enough experience and knowledge out there One of the challenges is, keeping tabs with it, and things can turn overnight. But I don't think necessarily that, the big agencies are always the best solution in a sense. And we're not the only people sort of coming up with, interesting ways of using all this kit. We're lucky because we've got a department, that just does innovation, and all they do is just look for new stuff that we can try and shoehorn into some, campaign.
Is it harder for you to keep finding business or easier?
No, because I think, things are changing so much. The requirements of clients are changing so much. All this technology allows you to collect enormous quantities of data as well. So it gives you opportunities that maybe you didn't have, because you can understand more about the customer, about what you're trying to achieve. So we do a huge amount of sort of understanding, the environment beforehand, and just to sort of see what's going on. And that's really important, because I won't get it when we're doing campaigns abroad. If you want to do something that's going to change a behaviour or sell, market, whatever, you need to understand the subtle differences. So, we go to, markets, wherever we're going to go, to find the sort of the expertise, who tend to be, small, innovative, little companies or individuals. And the beauty of our sort of system, it's not like one of the massive big global agencies where you're sort of encouraged to use the rest of the network before any other solution. We'll try and find people in market who are the smartest, the guys who'll understand what works well on a Chinese page, because I look at it and I just cannot get my head around it. So I don't think we've got all the answers. What we, I think, value is a network of people out there who are playing and exploring and utilising it. And it's just being able to tap into it. That's the key for us, I suppose.
Great. Any more questions? Okay.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.